They called her the machine gun cruiser. To the sailors who fought beside her, the name wasn't a nickname. It was a statement of fact. The USS Helena, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, fired faster, hit harder, and survived more than any ship of her kind should have. She would live through Pearl Harbor, batter the Imperial Japanese Navy at Guadalcanal, and meet her fate at Kula Gulf, only to pass into legend as the ship that wouldn't die. Laid down at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the late 1930s, Helena represented a new breed of American cruiser, fast, bristling with 15 6-inch guns, protected by improved armor, and equipped with the latest fire control technology. When she joined the Pacific Fleet, few could have guessed that this sleek warship would one day become one of the most battle-tested vessels of World War II. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Helena sat moored at Pearl Harbor's 1010 dock, tied up near the battleship Pennsylvania and the mine layer Oglala. At 7:57 a.m., the first Japanese plane swept over Oahu. A torpedo meant for Pennsylvania struck Helena instead, tearing a hole near her engine room. Electric power failed, compartments flooded, and dozens of men were killed instantly. But the ship did not sink. Within minutes, her gunners brought the anti-aircraft batteries to life, firing back even as fuel and debris burned around the harbor. When the smoke cleared, Helena still floated, scarred but alive, and her crew's fury was just beginning to burn. In the chaos of Pearl Harbor, she had already proved a strange kind of resilience that would define her career. Engineers patched the hull, restored power, and within weeks the cruiser was steaming towards the continental United States for permanent repairs. Her survival became a symbol that America could absorb the first blow and strike back harder. In the shipyards of California, Helena was reborn. Her wounds were sealed, her systems modernized, and she was fitted with the Navy's newest secret weapon, the SG radar, capable of detecting enemy ships long before they appeared on the horizon. The men who returned to her decks sensed that Helena's war had only just begun, and that she carried with her the ghosts of Pearl Harbor. By early 1942, the workshops at Mare Island buzzed around a single purpose: to turn the wounded cruiser into a hunter. The USS Helena's hull plates were replaced, her engines overhauled, and new radar arrays and directors rose from her superstructure like metallic eyes. The technicians who had seen her limp in from Pearl Harbor called her a ghost come back for payback. When she sailed out again that June, her gray paint still fresh, the Helena was no longer just a warship. She was a statement. She had 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, 10 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, and layers of rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons that bristled from every deck. Crews drilled until muscle memory turned metal into rhythm. When those guns opened up, the sound was a rolling drumbeat. When all batteries spoke at once, it was a roar so continuous that enemy pilots later swore the Americans had built an automatic cruiser. Her first missions after Pearl Harbor were convoy escorts and patrols across the South Pacific, ferrying troops and supplies through seas still haunted by Japanese submarines. But every man aboard knew the real fight was coming. Reports of battles raging around Guadalcanal filled the mess decks. The Navy was bleeding for a tiny strip of jungle airfield named Henderson Field. In September 1942, Helena joined Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott. With the heavy cruiser San Francisco and Salt Lake City beside her, she steamed toward the Solomon Islands. Night after night, the ships trained their new radar sets, learning to read the glowing blips that marked unseen enemies beyond the horizon. Helena's SG radar could pick up destroyers 20 miles away, a revolution in naval warfare. On the evening of October 11, 1942, as Japanese reinforcements tried to slip down the slot toward Guadalcanal, Helena's screen lit up with targets. For the first time in history, an American surface fleet prepared to fight a radar-directed night battle. The crew took stations, magazines opened, breech blocks slammed shut. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover ordered, "Commence firing when ready." At 11:46 p.m., Helena's forward turrets erupted, hurling a wall of shells into the dark. Within minutes, her gunners had fired more than 1,500 rounds. The Japanese cruisers Furutaka and Aoba staggered under the storm. One destroyer exploded outright. Radar had given Helena and her sisters eyes in the night, and the Imperial Navy never saw it coming. That night at Cape Esperance marked the first clear American surface victory of the Pacific War. As the smoke drifted across the moonlit sea, the men of Helena understood. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor was now delivering retribution, shot by shot. By the time Helena's guns fell silent off Cape Esperance, the men of Task Force 64 understood they had crossed a line. The Japanese, masters of the night sea since Pearl Harbor, had finally been driven back in confusion. Word spread fast through the fleet. Radar and discipline had changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Helena became the workhorse of the Solomon campaign. She ran supply convoys to Henderson Field, guarded the battered carriers still limping from earlier battles, and prowled Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water off Guadalcanal already littered with wrecks. Each night, the glow of distant fires marked another clash between destroyers and cruisers. For the crew, life blurred into a pattern of readiness. Daylight meant cleaning guns and tending engines. Twilight meant battle stations. Japanese bombers came almost daily, streaking out of the clouds to drop torpedoes and 500-pound bombs. Helena's anti-aircraft crews learned to track them by ear, counting the seconds between the whine of dive breaks and the crash of explosions. They brought down several attackers, but there was no celebration, only the grim relief of survival. By early November 1942, a major Japanese convoy moved south to retake Guadalcanal. Helena and a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan were ordered to intercept. The night of November 13th would become one of the most brutal surface engagements in U.S. naval history, the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Just after midnight, Helena's radar picked up shapes creeping along the coast. 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 11 destroyers escorting troop transports. At a range of barely 3 miles, spotlights flashed on, and the sea erupted in flame. Helena opened with everything she had. Her turrets spewed fire like furnaces. In 20 minutes, she fired nearly 2,000 rounds, her shells ripping into the enemy cruiser, Sendai, and several destroyers. The Americans won by inches. 2 of their own cruisers were lost, and Callahan himself was killed. But the Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field was stopped. On that narrow margin of victory, control of Guadalcanal began to turn. When dawn came, Helena's decks were littered with brass casings and shrapnel scars. Her crew was exhausted, deaf from the concussion of their own guns, yet alive. They had faced battleships at point-blank range and survived. For the rest of the campaign, Helena's name was spoken with respect, by friend and foe alike. After the smoke of the first naval battle drifted away, the sea around Guadalcanal turned eerily quiet. For the sailors of the Helena, quiet never meant safety. Beneath the black waves of Iron Bottom Sound lay dozens of ships, American and Japanese, marking where the fight for the Solomons had already claimed thousands. Every night could add another name to that underwater graveyard. The Helena remained on station. Her crew patched bullet holes, replaced shattered bridge windows, and scraped soot from her barrels. But the order always came again. Return to the slot. The Japanese called the channel the Tokyo Express, using destroyers to rush troops and supplies down to Guadalcanal. The Helena and her companions hunted them relentlessly. Each mission began the same way. The sky would fade from blood red to black, and the radar screens would glow green in the darkened plotting room. The SG radar, still a new marvel of war, picked up faint echoes that the naked eye could never see. The crew would whisper reports from station to station until Captain Hoover gave the order to fire. When the Helena opened up, her triple turrets flashed in rhythm. The sea around her turned white with muzzle blasts, and the smell of burned powder clung to every railing. Japanese destroyers tried to fight back with torpedoes, their long lances streaking invisibly through the dark water. More than once, lookouts saw wakes slicing toward them, and the helm swung hard over as explosions thundered past the stern. During one grim November night, a friendly ship took a direct hit and disappeared in seconds. The Helena slowed to rescue survivors, hauling men from the oil-slicked sea, even as lookouts shouted warnings of more incoming fire. They saved dozens before pulling away under another air raid at dawn. Those weeks forged the Helena's reputation. She was always in the thick of it, shooting, rescuing, patrolling, never resting. Sailors from other ships joked that if there was shooting anywhere near the Solomons, you could find the Helena by following the thunder. The name machine gun cruiser spread across the fleet not as a legend, but as a simple statement of fact. By January 1943, the tide around Guadalcanal had turned. Japanese reinforcements withdrew under relentless attack from American ships and planes. The Helena and her crew had survived months of ceaseless combat. They were tired, scarred, and proud. Ahead lay repairs, and then another call to battle. The Pacific War was far from over. When Helena finally steamed out of the Solomons, the scars of constant battle showed on every inch of her steel skin. Patches covered torpedo dents, paint blistered from heat and salt, and her gun barrels were worn smooth from thousands of rounds. Yet, as she entered the calm blue of safer waters, her crew stood taller. They had survived the worst the Imperial Navy could throw. In early 1943, Helena was ordered back to the United States for repairs and refitting. The long voyage across the Pacific was almost unreal for the men who had lived months on battle alert. At Mare Island again, welders and mechanics swarmed over her decks. Engineers upgraded her anti-aircraft batteries, replaced exhausted barrels, and checked the delicate SG radar that had guided her through the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. The men were given brief shore leave. Many wrote letters home, describing their strange mixture of pride and exhaustion, though censorship kept them from revealing details. Some visited families, others just slept for days, unable to believe they no longer had to dive for cover at the whine of aircraft. By late spring, orders came down. Helena was to return to the front. The campaign for Guadalcanal was over, but the Solomons chain still blocked the Allies' path toward Japan. The next targets were New Georgia and Kolombangara, and Admiral William Halsey's forces would need every ship that could sail. The crew accepted the news with quiet determination. They knew what awaited them, another gauntlet of night battles and torpedo ambushes, but none flinched. The Helena had become a family bound by fire. Her gunners trusted their weapons. Her officers trusted their men. She carried new recruits now, fresh faces who listened wide-eyed to veterans' stories of Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal. On May 11, 1943, Helena departed San Francisco Bay once more. Her decks gleamed, her engines hummed smoothly, and her hull bore the marks of a veteran ship returning to war. As she passed under the Golden Gate Bridge, sailors lined the rails, waving toward the shore they hoped to see again. They were heading back to the Solomon Islands, back into the narrow, haunted waters that had already claimed so many. The crew didn't know it yet, but their next battle would be the one that wrote the final chapter of the machine gun cruiser. When Helena rejoined the Pacific Fleet in mid-1943, she looked sharper than ever. Fresh paint, tuned engines, new radar gear. But beneath the surface, her crew carried the memories of Iron Bottom Sound. For many, it felt like returning to the same nightmare, just under a different moon. The Solomons chain was still a battleground. The Japanese were reinforcing New Georgia, hoping to slow the Allied advance toward Rabaul. Admiral Halsey's plan was simple and brutal. Isolate and crush each stronghold, one island at a time. Helena's assignment was to provide gunfire support for the landings and intercept Japanese reinforcements trying to slip down the slot. On the night of June 30th, 1943, the invasion of New Georgia began. Helena's guns opened up before dawn, turning the shoreline into a sheet of fire. Marines who landed that morning said they could still feel the deck-shaking thunder echoing across the beach hours later. Her radar-directed salvos were devastatingly precise. Bridges, supply dumps, and coastal defenses vanished under clouds of dust and flame. But the Japanese were not finished. Their destroyers continued running night convoys down the slot, moving troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. Allied forces set traps, and Helena was often in the lead. On July 5th, after another day of bombardment, her task force, composed of 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, was ordered north to intercept an enemy flotilla approaching from the northwest. The sea that night was calm, almost too calm. The moon hung low, silvering the surface of Kula Gulf. On the radar screens, faint dots appeared. Enemy ships. The word passed through the Helena's compartments, and the crew raced to battle stations. Doors slammed shut, ammunition hoists clattered, and the familiar rhythm of combat returned. At exactly 1:57 a.m., the order came. Open fire! Helena's triple 6-inch turrets thundered in unison. Her radar-guided guns found their targets instantly, and within minutes, 2 Japanese destroyers were burning. Crewmen shouted over the roar. Shells clanged down hoists, and the air filled with cordite smoke. But the enemy had already launched their deadly reply. Torpedoes. Long lances, fast and invisible, racing toward the Helena through the dark. It was just after 2:00 a.m. on July 6, 1943, when fate caught up with the USS Helena. In the chaos of the Battle of Kula Gulf, she had fired faster and more accurately than any ship afloat, her 6-inch guns spitting fire every 3 seconds. But in the darkness, the Japanese destroyers had already unleashed a spread of long-lance torpedoes, each one capable of splitting a cruiser in 2. The first hit struck Helena amidships on the port side. The deck heaved, lights flickered, and the roar of escaping steam filled every corridor. Before damage control could respond, a second torpedo slammed into her bow, followed by a third near the engine room. In less than 2 minutes, the machine gun cruiser was mortally wounded. Captain Charles P. Cecil ordered the crew to abandon ship. The bow was already gone, the stern lifting out of the water, propellers still spinning in the air. Men jumped into the Black Pacific, grabbing rafts, planks, anything that floated. Others stayed behind to help wounded shipmates reach the deck. Some refused to leave their guns until the last shell was fired. By 2:05 a.m., Helena broke apart. Her midsection disappeared beneath the waves in a roar of hissing steam and exploding ammunition. The forward and aft sections remained afloat for a few minutes, then slowly slipped under. Within minutes, the sea was empty, except for hundreds of men struggling in the dark. The battle raged on around them. Japanese destroyers fled north. American ships pursued, unaware that Helena had vanished. Survivors clung to debris, oil-slicked and half-blinded by salt water. Dawn revealed an awful sight. Hundreds scattered across miles of open sea, with sharks circling beneath them. Nearby ships risked returning under daylight air attack to search for survivors. Destroyer USS Nicholas and USS Radford managed to pull nearly 750 men from the water over the next 2 days. Yet dozens more drifted for days, some reaching islands held by the enemy, where coast watchers and local villagers risked their lives to hide them from Japanese patrols. For those who made it back, the loss of Helena was like losing a friend. She had survived Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and every night battle in between, only to fall in one final blaze of courage. But even in sinking, she bought victory. Her radar-guided fire helped drive the enemy from Kula Gulf, securing another step toward Japan. When the sun rose on July 6, 1943, the men of the USS Helena faced a nightmare that no sailor ever forgets. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and a dozen battles was gone. All that remained were hundreds of oil-soaked sailors scattered across the Kula Gulf, clinging to whatever wreckage they could find. Some huddled together on battered rafts. Others floated alone, their faces burned from fuel and gunpowder. The sea was deceptively calm, the water a mirror reflecting the smoke still hanging from the night's fight. But beneath that surface, danger stirred. Fins cut the water, sharks drawn by the noise and the smell of blood. At dawn, destroyers USS Nicholas and USS Radford returned to search for survivors. Japanese aircraft still prowled the skies, forcing the rescue ships to weave and dodge even as their crews tossed nets and ropes overboard. For hours, sailors were hauled from the sea, shivering, injured, and half-blinded by salt. By the time night fell again, nearly 750 men had been pulled to safety, but dozens more were missing. 3 lifeboats, packed with roughly 80 men, had drifted far from the battle site. With little food and almost no fresh water, they rowed west, hoping to reach friendly islands. For 3 days, they battled heat, exhaustion, and hunger. Some collapsed from dehydration. Others sang or prayed to stay awake. On the 3rd day, they sighted land, Vela la Vela, an island held by Japanese patrols. The survivors knew that capture meant imprisonment or worse. Then, miraculously, they encountered New Zealand coastwatcher Reg Evans and local villagers loyal to the Allies. At great personal risk, the islanders hid the Americans in the jungle, feeding them coconuts and rainwater, while Japanese troops searched nearby. Evans radioed for help using a concealed transmitter, and within days, a daring rescue was launched. American PT boats slipped through the dark to Vella Lavella's coast, evading enemy patrols. In a tense nighttime pickup under heavy rain, they spirited 104 survivors to safety. The men who returned were exhausted but alive, thanks to courage, loyalty, and luck. The story of their survival became one of the most remarkable in the Pacific War. For them, Helena was more than a ship. She was a spirit that refused to die, even after the sea had claimed her steel. The sinking of the USS Helena marked the end of one of the most extraordinary fighting careers of any U.S. Navy cruiser. But in the months and years that followed, her story only grew larger, told in mess halls, shipyards, and homes across America. To those who had served aboard her, Helena was not just a ship. She was a living symbol of resilience, precision, and unbreakable spirit. When the survivors finally reached Allied bases, they were greeted as heroes. Newspapers carried headlines about "the ship that wouldn't die," a name that would stay with Helena forever. Even Admiral Halsey, not known for sentiment, praised her crew's endurance, calling their stand at Kula Gulf one of the Navy's proudest moments. Helena's loss underscored both the promise and peril of the modern naval war she helped shape. She was one of the first cruisers to use SG radar in combat, a technology that revolutionized night fighting. Her radar-directed guns had struck targets invisible to the naked eye, proving that electronics could decide battles just as much as courage. At shipyards across the U.S., new Brooklyn-class cruisers carried pieces of her design and lessons from her service. Her gunnery methods became standard practice. Her radar systems were improved and fitted onto dozens of ships heading west across the Pacific. Even her veterans helped train new crews, passing down what they'd learned in the crucible of Guadalcanal and Kula Gulf. In Washington, Helena's name was awarded to a new vessel, the USS Helena CL-113, a modern light cruiser built in 1945 to carry on her legacy. Although the war ended before the second Helena saw combat, the name remained a badge of honor. The Navy had promised that Helena would sail again, and she did. For the families of the fallen, memorials rose in her honor, from Pearl Harbor to Helena, Montana, the city for which she'd been named. Letters from the survivors described the moments before she sank, the bravery of men who refused to leave their stations, and the strange quiet that followed the roar of her guns. In every retelling, one truth remained the same. The USS Helena fought harder, fired faster, and endured longer than anyone thought possible. She lived up to her nickname, the machine gun cruiser, not just for the speed of her guns, but for the heart of her crew. For decades, the final resting place of the USS Helena remained a mystery. Survivors remembered the night of fire and chaos, but in those violent hours of July 6, 1943, few could mark where she had gone down. The war moved on, and the sea quietly claimed her. For the families of the 168 men lost, there was no grave to visit, only the vast Pacific. In the years after the war, the story of Helena's final battle became part of naval legend. She had fought with such ferocity that even Japanese officers later expressed respect for her gunnery. But still, the question remained, where did the machine gun cruiser rest? Then, 75 years later, in April 2018, an expedition led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel finally found her. Using advanced sonar and remote submersibles, the team scanned the ocean floor near the Solomon Islands. At a depth of 2,800 feet, they discovered the broken remains of a light cruiser lying silently in the darkness. When the cameras descended, there was no doubt. It was USS Helena, CL-50. Her hull, still bearing the proud shape of the Brooklyn class, lay in two major sections. The bow was crushed, but the gun turrets and bridge were remarkably intact. Even after 75 years, her anti-aircraft guns pointed toward the sky, as if still standing guard. For the families and the few remaining survivors, the discovery brought long-awaited closure. The Navy honored the site as a war grave, a place of rest for the men who went down with their ship. Memorial services were held in Montana, Pearl Harbor, and Washington, D.C., where Helena's name was read alongside other lost ships of the Pacific War. Under the black water of Kula Gulf, the wreck remains untouched, a silent monument to courage and sacrifice. Time and corrosion have claimed her steel, but not her story. In the glow of ROV lights, her nameplate still glimmers faintly, letters spelling out Helena through the silt. She is still there, the machine gun cruiser that would not die, guarding the same waters where her guns once thundered. Long before the USS Helena became a legend, she was born from a revolution in naval design. In the mid-1930s, the United States Navy faced strict limitations under international treaties that capped ship size and armament. To meet those restrictions while maximizing firepower, American engineers created something bold: the Brooklyn-class cruiser. These ships were the answer to Japan's new light cruisers, which carried deadly 6-inch guns in massive numbers. The U.S. response was simple but ingenious: build a ship that could fire faster, farther, and more accurately than anything afloat. The USS Helena, CL-50, was the 7th of 9 Brooklyn-class cruisers, laid down at the New York Navy Yard in 1936 and commissioned on September 18, 1939, just weeks after World War II began in Europe. Her specifications were impressive. She displaced over 10,000 tons, stretched 608 feet from bow to stern, and carried 15 6-inch to 47 caliber guns arranged in 5 triple turrets. Those guns could send nearly 17,000 pounds of shells downrange every minute. Combined with cutting-edge fire control systems, Helena could blanket a target with shells so quickly that Japanese sailors later swore she carried automatic weapons. Below decks, she was a marvel of engineering: 9 boilers, 4 turbines, and a top speed of 32.5 knots. She carried thick armor along her sides and decks, enough to shrug off most destroyer-caliber weapons. Yet, what truly set her apart was something invisible: radar. By 1941, Helena was among the first U.S. warships equipped with experimental radar systems capable of detecting enemy aircraft and ships beyond visual range. It was this technology, refined and perfected during her service, that made her one of the deadliest cruisers of the Pacific. Her design became a blueprint for a new generation of American cruisers, influencing the later Cleveland and Baltimore classes. Even today, naval historians point to the Brooklyn class as a turning point, a bridge between the gun-dominated fleets of the 1930s and the radar-directed naval warfare that defined World War II. When Helena first slid into the water in 1938, no one could have imagined how far she would go, or how fiercely she would fight. But from her first trials, she showed signs of what was to come: a perfect balance of speed, firepower, and resilience. When the USS Helena, CL-50, first touched the water at the New York Navy Yard in 1938, she represented the future of the U.S. Navy. Sleek, powerful, and bristling with armament, she joined the fleet just as the world was sliding toward war. But for her first 2 years, Helena's mission was simple: train, patrol, and prepare. After commissioning in September 1939, Helena was assigned to the Pacific Fleet. Her early days were spent conducting gunnery exercises off the California coast and joint operations with other cruisers and carriers. The Navy was still learning how to integrate radar into its tactics, and Helena's advanced systems made her a floating laboratory. Sailors practiced detecting and tracking mock enemy ships in all weather and darkness, refining skills that would later save countless lives. In 1940, Helena was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The island base was the jewel of the Pacific Fleet, a paradise that also stood as America's frontline defense. Life aboard Helena was steady, but demanding. Her crew drilled constantly, learning to handle the powerful 6-inch guns and maintain the complex fire control computers below deck. On weekends, sailors went ashore to Honolulu's beaches and theaters, unaware that their peaceful days were numbered. By late 1941, the tension in the Pacific was unmistakable. Reports of Japanese aggression in China and French Indochina reached even the lower decks. Officers studied maps of the Philippines and Wake Island, wondering when the shooting would start. Still, few believed war would reach Hawaii. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. At 7:55 a.m., Helena was moored at Pearl Harbor's 1010 dock, near the battleship Pennsylvania. The crew was preparing for a quiet Sunday when the first Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. Within seconds, bombs fell across the harbor. A torpedo streaked across the water and slammed into Helena's starboard side. The blast rocked the cruiser, flooding her engine room and killing dozens instantly. But unlike so many ships that morning, Helena stayed afloat. Damage control teams sealed the flooding compartments while gunners scrambled to their stations. In less than 5 minutes, her anti-aircraft guns were firing back, sending streams of tracer fire into the attacking planes. Helena's return fire that morning made her one of the first American ships to strike back at Japan in World War II. Though damaged, she survived the attack, and in doing so, earned her place in history. The torpedo that hit USS Helena at Pearl Harbor should have ended her war before it even began. The blast tore through her starboard engine room, flooding compartments and cutting power across the ship. Yet, against all odds, she stayed afloat. Within minutes, her crew sealed off the damaged sections and fought back, their guns roaring through smoke and chaos. When the attack ended, Helena lay scarred but alive, a survivor amid the burning wrecks around Ford Island. In the days that followed, divers and repair crews worked around the clock to stabilize her. She was patched temporarily in Hawaii, then ordered back to the mainland for a complete overhaul. As tugboats guided her out of Pearl Harbor, sailors watched the shattered hulls of the Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia slip past, grim reminders of what she had escaped. By January 1942, Helena was at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. There, engineers stripped her damaged plating, repaired her engines, and upgraded her defenses. She received new radar systems, improved anti-aircraft batteries, and fresh armor along critical compartments. Her crew returned to duty with renewed determination. They had seen the war's beginning, and were eager to return for payback. Training intensified. The gunners practiced until their arms ached, turning the firing range into a thunderous echo chamber. Radar operators learned to read faint contacts on green glowing screens, perfecting the coordination that would make Helena's gunnery so feared. By the time she steamed out of Mare Island in mid-1942, she was faster, tougher, and more lethal than before. Her orders were to join Task Force 67 under Admiral Norman Scott, part of the desperate fight for the Solomon Islands. There, the Marines clung to a small, half-finished airstrip called Henderson Field, and the Imperial Navy was determined to crush them. Helena's radar and rapid-fire 6-inch guns would soon prove decisive in those dark waters. On October 11th, 1942, she entered the Battle of Cape Esperance, her first major engagement. Under the cover of night, her radar spotted enemy ships long before the Japanese realized they'd been found. Helena's guns opened up with astonishing speed, 15 barrels hammering out a storm of shells every few seconds. Within minutes, Japanese cruisers were burning. The machine gun cruiser had returned to war, and this time she was the hunter. The night of October 11th, 1942, was Helena's moment of vengeance. Off the northwest coast of Guadalcanal, in the dark waters near Cape Esperance, the U.S. Navy prepared to ambush a Japanese task force approaching from the north. It was a desperate fight for control of the Solomon Islands, one that would decide the fate of Henderson Field and the Marines clinging to it. Admiral Norman Scott commanded a small force of cruisers and destroyers, including Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena. Their radar operators had been scanning the horizon for hours when faint echoes appeared around 11:32 p.m. Enemy ships closing fast. Scott's voice came over the intercom. "Open fire when ready!" Helena's gunnery crew needed no second order. Using her advanced SG radar, she locked onto the lead target and unleashed a torrent of 6-inch shells. 15 guns roared at once, lighting the Black Sea with thunderous flashes. Within moments, Helena's salvo found its mark. Japanese cruiser Furutaka burst into flames, followed by Fubuki, a destroyer that was blown apart in seconds. Her rate of fire was staggering. In less than 10 minutes, Helena had fired over 1,200 rounds, so many that other ships in the task force thought she was equipped with automatic weapons. The Japanese, caught off guard, fired wildly into the dark. Their formation broke apart under the relentless barrage. When the battle ended after midnight, the Americans had won a clear victory. 3 Japanese ships were sunk, and several more damaged beyond repair. Helena herself was untouched. For the first time in the Pacific War, a U.S. surface fleet had defeated a Japanese task force at night, thanks largely to radar and Helena's devastating firepower. But for her crew, the triumph was more than tactical. It was personal. Less than a year earlier, they had watched their ship bleed in the waters of Pearl Harbor. Now she had repaid that debt in full. The machine gun cruiser had earned her name in the thunder of Cape Esperance. Word of the victory spread quickly across the Pacific. Sailors began calling Helena the ship that fired faster than sound. Even Admiral Halsey sent his congratulations, saying simply, "Well done, Helena. You have shown the way." The victory, however, was only the beginning. Greater challenges and darker nights still awaited her in the Solomon Islands. Barely a month after her triumph at Cape Esperance, the USS Helena was called back into action, this time for one of the fiercest surface engagements in naval history. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought on the night of November 13th, 1942. The situation was desperate. Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, were moving down the slot to bombard Henderson Field, the airstrip that kept the Marines on Guadalcanal alive. If the Japanese succeeded, the entire campaign could collapse. Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force, 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, was sent to intercept them. Among those cruisers was the battle-hardened Helena. The night was moonless, the sky thick with tropical haze. Helena's radar detected enemy ships just after 1:30 a.m. Massive returns indicating battleships closing fast. But confusion reigned on the American flagship. Orders were misheard. Ships fired at different targets. In that chaos, Helena's radar-guided guns once again brought order through fire. Without hesitation, she opened up with all 15 6-inch barrels. Shells screamed through the dark, smashing into Japanese destroyers at point-blank range. The sea erupted in fireballs, as ships on both sides traded salvos at ranges of less than 3,000 yards. Helena's gunners fired so fast that her turrets glowed red. Her radar operators, cool under pressure, called out new targets one after another. At one point, Helena found herself nose-to-nose with a Japanese cruiser. In seconds, 3 full salvos struck the enemy ship, breaking it apart. Yet, around her, friendly ships were being torn to pieces. The destroyers, Cushing, Laffey, and Barton, went down in flames. Even the flagship San Francisco was hit repeatedly. When dawn finally came, the sea was littered with wreckage and burning oil. The Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled and later sunk by American planes, ending Japan's plan to shell Henderson Field. The cost was terrible, but the mission had succeeded, and Helena's radar-directed gunnery had again been decisive. Her crew was exhausted, ears ringing from hours of non-stop firing, but proud. They had stood toe-to-toe with the Imperial Navy's finest and survived. The machine gun cruiser had once again proven that precision and speed could overcome even the might of battleships. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a turning point. From that night on, the Japanese would never again threaten the island with surface warships, and Helena, though battered and scarred, emerged as one of the most feared cruisers in the entire Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War, but victory came with a brutal cost. For months afterward, USS Helena and her crew remained trapped in a deadly routine, fighting, repairing, and fighting again. The stretch of ocean between the Solomon Islands became known as the Slot, a narrow corridor of death where Japanese and American ships clashed almost nightly. The Helena was now a veteran among veterans. Her hull still bore the scars of previous battles, and her decks smelled permanently of powder and oil. Every time she returned to port, her crew patched holes, replaced barrels, and cleaned soot from her turrets. Yet, before the paint could dry, new orders always came. Return to the Slot. Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, made high-speed night runs down the channel to deliver troops and supplies to their garrisons. Helena and her task force hunted them relentlessly, guided by radar and the dark silhouettes of burning ships. Night after night, the guns thundered, their reports echoing across black water until dawn. The strain was unimaginable. Sleep came in stolen hours, nerves frayed. Many sailors admitted later that they lost all sense of time. The war became one endless night, punctuated by flashes of orange fire. Still, Helena's crew maintained their discipline, their efficiency almost mechanical. Her radar-directed batteries were so precise that enemy ships sometimes went down before realizing they were under attack. But the danger worked both ways. The Japanese long-lance torpedoes haunted every battle. Invisible and deadly, they struck without warning. The crew never forgot the sight of friendly ships vanishing in geysers of flame. The Juno, Atlanta, and others lost in seconds. Every explosion reminded them how fragile even a great ship could be. By early 1943, the Japanese began withdrawing from Guadalcanal. The relentless American offensive, powered by radar, aviation, and superior logistics, had finally broken their grip. Helena had been at the center of that campaign from start to finish. For her crew, there was pride, but also exhaustion. They had fought for nearly 6 months with little rest. When orders came for Helena to head back to the States for repairs, no one cheered. They simply nodded, quietly relieved. The machine gun cruiser had become a legend, but legends, too, could bleed. After months of relentless combat in the Solomon Islands, the USS Helena finally received the order her exhausted crew had been waiting for: return home. When she turned her bow eastward in early 1943, her decks were dented, her paint scorched, and her guns worn smooth from constant firing. Yet despite her wounds, she remained proud and ready, the very image of a veteran warship. The voyage back to the United States was quiet, almost unnervingly so. For men who had lived through endless nights of shellfire, the stillness of the open Pacific felt strange. They cleaned their uniforms, wrote letters home, and tried to sleep without the fear of alarms. Some said it was the first time they had heard silence in over a year. When Helena entered Mare Island Naval Shipyard once again, she was greeted like a returning hero. Workers lined the docks, waving at the battle-worn cruiser that had survived everything the enemy could throw at her. Newspapers called her the machine gun cruiser, and families of her crew clipped the headlines with pride. The overhaul was massive. Engineers replaced her guns, upgraded her radar, and installed the latest anti-aircraft defenses. The Navy wanted her ready for the next stage of the Pacific campaign: new invasions, new islands, and new battles. Her crew, though weary, took pride in helping the shipyard teams. They polished brass, repainted hull markings, and carved small mementos from worn gunmetal. Tokens of battle survived. For a few short weeks, Helena's men tasted normal life again. They spent leave in San Francisco, eating real meals, visiting families, or simply watching the sun set over the bay. But every man knew it was temporary. The war was far from over, and their ship, their home, would soon head back into danger. By May 1943, the USS Helena looked reborn. Her fresh paint gleamed, her machinery hummed smoothly, and the crew stood taller than ever before. She was no longer just a ship that had survived. She was a ship destined to return. On May 11th, she departed San Francisco Bay, passing beneath the Golden Gate Bridge as sailors lined her rails in silence. None could know it then, but this would be her final journey homeward. Ahead lay the Solomon Islands once more, and the battle that would write her last chapter. By early June 1943, the USS Helena was once again slicing through the Pacific, her hull shining with new paint and her engines tuned to perfection. She was faster, stronger, and more lethal than ever before, but her crew knew what awaited them. The Solomon Islands, with their black waters and invisible dangers, were calling her back. The new campaign's objective was New Georgia, another vital step in the island-hopping path toward Japan. The Japanese still controlled the region, using it as a staging ground for aircraft and supply convoys. Admiral William F. Halsey planned to strike hard and fast, and Helena would play a key role in the opening moves. After weeks at sea, Helena rejoined her familiar companions, cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis, along with several destroyers. Together, they formed a task force designed for one thing: night action. Every man aboard knew that radar would once again be their eyes in the darkness. The Tokyo Express still roamed those waters, and Helena had earned a deadly reputation among Japanese sailors. On the evening of July 5th, 1943, the task force entered Kula Gulf under cover of darkness. Their mission? Intercept an enemy reinforcement group heading for Kolombangara. Radar contacts appeared just after midnight, multiple ships moving fast from the north. Helena's crew went to battle stations, the familiar routines unfolding like clockwork. Shells were loaded, turrets swung into position, and the fire control radar began tracking targets. At 1:57 a.m., the order came. Open fire! Helena's 6-inch guns erupted, lighting the sea with a blinding wall of flame. In less than 5 minutes, she fired over 100 rounds, each shell finding its mark. 2 Japanese destroyers vanished in explosions so bright that nearby ships momentarily lost their night vision. But even as her gunners cheered their hits, danger was closing in. The Japanese destroyers had already launched their deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, silent killers racing toward the American line at more than 45 knots. Helena, firing faster than any other ship in the fleet, had made herself the brightest target in the Gulf. The men on deck could not see it yet, but fate was already on its way. 3 streaks in the dark, slicing through the black water straight toward the heart of the machine gun cruiser. At 2:03 a.m., on July 6, 1943, the ocean around USS Helena erupted. The first Long Lance torpedo slammed into her portside amidships with a deafening roar, lifting the entire cruiser out of the water. Men were thrown off their feet, bulkheads buckled, and steam lines burst, flooding compartments with scalding vapor. Before anyone could react, a second torpedo struck near the bow, tearing it open like paper. Captain Charles P. Cecil, calm amid the chaos, ordered, "All hands, prepare to abandon ship." But fate had one final blow to deliver. A third torpedo, hitting near the engine room, splitting Helena almost in 2. Power flickered, the radar went dark, and for a few long seconds, only the sound of rushing water filled the ship. Below deck, engineers struggled to keep the pumps running, as others helped wounded crewmates reach the surface. Flames licked through twisted metal, as ammunition cooked off in the heat. On the main deck, sailors worked desperately to free life rafts, shouting orders over the thunder of collapsing bulkheads. At 2:05 a.m., Helena's midsection gave way. The cruiser broke apart, her bow and stern rising high before sliding beneath the waves. Men clung to floating wreckage, coughing through smoke and oil. Some refused to leave their gun stations until the ship was gone beneath them. The sea around Kula Gulf became a living graveyard of wreckage, oil, and the faint cries of survivors calling to one another in the dark. Nearby ships Nicholas and Radford turned back under enemy fire to rescue survivors. Despite the threat of torpedoes and air attack, their crews pulled hundreds of men from the sea throughout the night. Others, trapped on drifting rafts, floated for days, burned, dehydrated, and surrounded by sharks. Of Helena's crew of 868 men, over 700 survived, but 168 never returned. Many of those lost had fought their ship to the very end. In their final moments, the machine gun cruiser had done what she always did: fight with speed, precision, and defiance. When dawn broke over Kula Gulf, the sea was calm again. The battle was over, but the legend of USS Helena had only just begun. When the smoke cleared over Kula Gulf, the USS Helena was gone, swallowed by the same sea she had fought across for nearly 2 years. But her spirit didn't sink with her hull. In the weeks and months that followed, her story spread through every port, every wardroom, and every home that had sent a son to sea. She became a legend, the ship that wouldn't die. Rescue operations continued long after the guns fell silent. The destroyers Nicholas and Radford managed to save hundreds of survivors from the oil-slicked waters. Yet 3 lifeboats, carrying nearly 100 men, had drifted far from the fleet. For days, those sailors battled hunger, thirst, and exposure under the unrelenting Pacific sun. When they finally reached Vela La Vela, an island occupied by Japanese forces, their ordeal seemed doomed to end in capture. But fate intervened. New Zealand coastwatcher Reg Evans and local villagers discovered the survivors and hid them deep in the jungle, feeding them coconuts and rainwater, while Japanese patrols searched nearby. Evans sent a coded radio message to Allied headquarters, and a daring rescue plan took shape. On the night of July 16, 1943, American PT boats slipped through enemy waters, picking up the exhausted men one by one under pouring rain. All 104 were brought home safely. The tale of Helena's crew, of bravery, sacrifice, and endurance, became one of the most inspiring in naval history. Even Admiral William F. Halsey, hardened by countless battles, wrote that Helena's loss was a heartbreak for the fleet. But he added, "She died as she lived, fighting to the end." In recognition of her service, Helena earned 7 battle stars for her extraordinary combat record, from Pearl Harbor to Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, and finally, Kula Gulf. Her gunnery set new standards for naval warfare. Her radar tactics became doctrine for the modern U.S. Navy. In 2018, 75 years after her sinking, explorers aboard the research vessel Petrel discovered Helena's wreck resting 2,800 feet below the Solomon Islands. Her name was still visible on the shattered hull, quiet, dignified, eternal. To this day, she remains a symbol of American resilience. The USS Helena did more than fight battles. She carried the spirit of a nation learning to stand unbreakable against the storm. She truly was the machine gun cruiser that would not die.